Okay, welcome back. This is going to be another lecture for Native American history. This is going to dive into some Maya slash Mesoamerican, but mostly Maya history. And the reason for the focus, especially on Maya history here, is because of the ways that they have been left out of the broader sort of narrative, sometimes eclipsed by a much shorter lived culture or young, I shouldn't say shorter lived, but Nahuatl culture, also known as the Aztecs, are much later. And I'll say some things about why that seems that these two groups of people, Mayas and the Aztecs, tend to be uh, groups that at least people have heard about, although not much about Native anything is taught in public schools in the United States. So let me go to the slideshow here and go from the start and jump in. So I will have some stuff to say about um, Nahuatl folks, Mexica, as they call themselves. That's where the name Mexico and Mexico City comes from. It was later a German scholar who named the Aztecs. But that's the more familiar designation these days. As with some of my other lectures here, for some of this anthropology and archaeological information, I'm indebted to Edwin Barnhart's great courses lectures on Mesoamerica. There's a lot that I'm pulling from that, and I'll tweak and ask some questions, and particularly with the voices of some of my native colleagues in mind, because there's a great deal of mistrust between uh, archaeologists, anthropologists, and many native peoples because of the history of native people being written out of things and the pure guesswork that goes on in archaeology. And so, as my friend Tink Tinker always says, archaeology is a great discipline because you just like can kind of dig things up and then make up your own story about things. It's like a um, and I think the reason why that attitude can be so dismissive towards anthropologists is because there's been a great deal of not listening to native folks when it comes to anthropologists, and that I already talked about a little bit in my earlier lecture, and it will come up again in the course. This map has shows the Yucatan, which is down where the Europeans first start arriving in Mesoamerica, but it's not really a good map of Maya territory because Maya territory will extend all the way down into Guatemala as well. But it gives a list of some of the cities. It uses, like many maps that you'll see in many ways that you'll hear scholars talk about it. It uses this Euro-Christian concept of empire. That's a Euro-Christian concept. It has a kind of top-down kind of way of thinking about it, and that doesn't seem to be the way that most natives um, are, are um, relating to each other and to the world, especially like when you say the Incan Empire, for example. Well, the name translates in Quechua that they give to their territory as the land of the four directions. So um, uh, when we pay more attention to the ways that Native people describe their own situations, we see more of that worldview that tends to be more collateral egalitarian, rather than top down. Doesn't mean that there weren't ever leaders or things, and it doesn't mean that isn't quite a bit of variation across different native cultures, right? So remember, worldview is deeper than culture. It used to be that scholars thought of Olmec culture in Mesoamerica as kind of the mother culture for all other folks, but more recent research suggests a parallel development among Maya, Zapotec, and Olmec peoples, and a cultural exchange through trade and shared innovations throughout the entire region. So just to try and bring some things into date here. And then again with this, if there's some reconsidering of the mother culture, and I have alongside with this some of the images of Maya textiles here. Archaeological findings are revealing simultaneous development across multiple regions. There's evidence of cross influence rather than linear cultural inheritance, like one group or civilization preceding another. So again, continuity. Um, there are charcoal painted handprints that I'll have an image of here as well. Now, I also want to say, in contrast to that, when you go down to Guatemala, which I've been to, you will notice that when you go to the different towns, like up in Chichicastenango, if you go down to Lake Aztlan, or sorry, um, the name will pop in um my head here. Again, I said Aztlan. Um, uh, um, if you go to Pana, which is one of the lake towns or something like that, you will notice that the women wear different patterns of textiles according to the town that they live in too, right? So there's a lot that's being communicated deeply in the textiles about where people belong. And yeah, they might all be Maya folks, but even within Maya culture, there's a lot of attention to where people are from and where they're relating to each other. um Lake Atitlan, sorry, is what I was. I don't know, maybe it was the Mexico thing that had me thinking about Atlan there for a sec. So um we'll continue on here. Lots of variation, and lots of, if we're going, but lots of like ancient continuity as well, culturally speaking. This is not exactly an early Maya settlement, this picture here, but the earliest Maya settlements are dating back to at least 10,000 years BCE. Um, Probably we're going to find older dates because that seems to be the pattern if you remember my earlier lectures. They start as small agrarian communities with ceremonial architecture. There is early evidence of writing and calendrical systems in the regions. Also, the iconography showing up in images that shows up of characters in Popova, which is one of their council book, as they call it. This map again was kind of showing like uh, Maya culture, but we know it also goes up to the Yucatan. And it was originally dividing between Olmec and um, we know that so there's simultaneous development of cultures, and there are long distance trade routes that connected Maya with Mesoamerican cultures. Some of the shared objects are jade, obsidian, cacao, feathers, pottery. There's an exchange of ideas, religious beliefs, and technologies. Uh, this is just an image of those charcoal painted handprints. They're dating back over 10,000 years here. They suggest ritual or symbolic practices by early inhabitants, according to the anthropologists here. And then we get a little bit later, we get the rise of Maya cities. There's a growth of ceremonial centers into complex urban sites. There's a development of political and religious hierarchies. Again, that term religion is a Euro-Christian concept, so be careful, and be careful with the ways that, again, people will want to talk about hierarchies as well. I understand why anthropologists want to do it, but Euro-Christians tend to overemphasize that kind of top-down hierarchical thing because they're always building it, or they're working with that idea of civilization, which is a very Euro-Christian idea itself. So they're looking for like what they might think of as complex cultural organizations or elite leaders and things like this. Um, you want to be very careful between when making cultural uh, statements. about ancient folks. We don't know, like just like um, but people have to base their jobs and careers and their PhDs, theses on these sorts of things. So sometimes people come and they're very heavy-handed about the way things are until somebody comes and kind of destroys the ways that they were thinking about things. So maybe we should just be more flexible from the beginning. Cities like Nakbe and El Mirador flourished in the pre-classic period. I'll have some coverage of what these periods that the anthropologists have. Maya invented their own writing system. It's one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient world. The glyphs are used in codices, monuments, and ceramics. It combined logograms and syllabic symbols. Um, and of course, probably people have heard about the calendar, so they have their own calendar and really complex um, astronomy that's uh, guides the rituals and agricultural cycles. Mayan astronomy aligns structures with celestial events as well. Again, that concept of religion, like keep it in quotes or something like that. But according to the anthropological tradition, Maya folks have a polytheistic religion with gods tied to nature and time. There's a belief in a layered universe of heavens, earth, and an underworld, like we've seen in earlier lectures. But again, they're not maybe necessarily as otherworldly for sure as the Euro-Christian tradition wants to put things. There are temples and pyramids that symbolized sacred mountains and cosmic order. Uh, Foundations are laid for the culture during the pre-classic period that show up as Maya civilization. Their enduring architectural feats, religious practices, and cultural identity, all the way into people who are still living today. And then there is an influence that extended from into the classic period and well beyond. So what anthropologists call the ancient period is going to be that period from about 2000 to 1000 BCE, and maybe pre-classic before that, because some of the stuff is going back, like 10,000 years, stuff like that. Um, First Mayan settlements are appearing right now, at least around 2600 BCE. Then the anthropologists call them the middle pre-classic period, here 1000 to 400 BCE. Here's where we're seeing that cross influence with Olmec and Zapotec cultures. Olmec cultures have colossal heads. There's sunken ball courts in many of the sites that are signaling the underworld, perhaps from Popol Vuh, which we'll talk about a little bit later on here. There's a vulture lord who's interred often with objects in Mesoamerica. There are local ceramics. There are distinct hieroglyphs during this period. The Maya people are not reliant on Olmec for cultural legitimacy. One of the questions we might ask ourselves, more contemporary question, is where exactly do we distinguish Maya culture from Olmec culture? Then we have late pre-classic, 400 BCE to about 250 CE. Um, we have communication across regions, mountains, Maya lowlands, and highlands. The Olmec do appear to have died out by this period. There's a disappearance of Olmec-style objects, at least in the region. Um, Emergence of Takalika Baj on the coast. There's 2000 or two, there was a 2010 discovery of a royal tomb by BYU professors. And that when that happened, there's this male interred with 3,000 objects from all over Mesoamerica. This is partly part of like what anthropologists weren't paying much attention to Mayan cultures because they weren't finding treasures and things like that for the like hundreds of years. So not until like the later 20th century. And so that for that reason, because Aztec cultures, as the Euro-Christians called them, tended to have more of the glittery objects that the Euro-Christian conquistadors were after. There tended to be more emphasis up there. And so even a lot of the cities and stuff and the temples don't get a lot of attention until much more recently. Hieroglyphs are showing up at least 20 or 36 BCE. At least that's the oldest to date that we see carved in something. But the earliest images of Mayan gods, Itzapa, are oriented towards volcanoes, northwest Takana, and northeast Tayamoco centers a town within a summer solstice. There's no hieroglyphs at the site, but there are 90 stelas with Mayan deities. So the stela are showing the cultural continuity earlier on. There's Chak, who's a rain god. Stela 2 has Khalil, a god of royal magic who can communicate with dead ancestors, whose left foot turns into a snake. And so we're seeing images of the characters that show up in the creation story that is recorded in the Popol Vuh. It's depicted on Stela 2 with seven macaw falling. Um, I'm not going to read all of these bullet points here, but they're there for you to pause and look at. Um, so um, uh, there's seems to be some crossover with Zapotec folks, and some shift in culture. So we like with Coyote masked ball players showing up in Oaxaca, werewolves, not jaguars, definitely wolves showing up. But you might see jaguars in other places. So this is foreign to the era, um, uh, uh, and or to the area, but not Mayan, who turn into jaguars. So interesting kind of cultural variation going on there. Um, um, uh, Caminalaju is, or Guatemala City, is the largest highland site. Dates about 1200 BCE to 800 current era. There's trading and mining obsidian and jade with Olmec by 1100 BCE. By 700 BCE, they have the largest population of corn, cotton production in Mesoamerica. Remember, corn had been developed like 7,000 years ago, had been cultivated in Mesoamerica. That's where it emerges from, maize, right? Um, there are really old stela that are possibly showing the revolution story from Popol Vuh. Um, there are over 500,000 pots in the trash, that which shows a massive population. In the lowlands, there were some of the oldest Maya cities in Patan. Um, El Mirador, the largest pyramid ever built in the Americas, which is 70 meters high. There's 600. This is 600 BCE, peaking around 100 CE. There are large bird masks on the pyramids. There are hero twins from the Popol Vuh and stucco and triadic pyramids on Ladanta Pyramid. There are three Hearthstone start stars spinning in Popol Vuh, and which correspond to Orion the Hunter, the pyramid. And this is something you can see today, and I saw it myself when I was in Chichicastenango. This is mirrored. Orion's belt is mirrored in Mayan homes and kitchens with like kind of three areas. Perhaps use it perhaps in the cities, they used up their resources. Nobody knows exactly why. But the cities oftentimes show like periods of abandonment. Um, there seems to be at times war conflicts showing up in the region too. Nobody knows for sure exactly this stuff. Um, there around that time there does seem that if you want to go with like the cultural conflict, that seems like there's some green obsidian coming in from Mexico with cultures around Teotihuacan. I'll have some stuff to say about that site later on here. At San Bartolo, or Bartolo, excuse me, there in 2001, there were findings of murals that are 100 BCE. There's elaborate paintings of Maya kings. Again, king is a Euro-Christian concept, so be careful, but it seems to be some sort of leader. It's unusual in that it shows humans and bloodletting of rulers' penises and then burning the blood created to uh, which created a kind of conduit to ancestors. One of them presents represents Hanapu, which is one of the characters from Popol Vuh, and his father as a maize god from Popol Vuh. So they found a building block with hieroglyphs from at least 300 BCE, which are the earliest ever found as painted. We don't know yet how to read all of the hieroglyphs. It suggests that Maya invented writing, not the Olmec, but they also transferred it to them. Sunken ball courts in the region are show up in many sites, and it probably suggests the underworld from Popol Vuh. But remember, there are also that sinking court tradition that goes down further south as well. Um, the Popol Vuh, which has now been translated as the Council Book, kind of disappears for a while and then a copy reappears. And what you want to be careful about with it is that the only way that we have access to the Popol Vuh is because the Euro-Christian missionaries were forcing the Maya scribes to write down their stuff and to translate it. And the reason why the Euro Christians were doing it was so that they could learn the practices of the Maya to see when they were practicing their own traditional religion and then extirpate it or stamp it out or kill people or burn people. So they end up being, the translations end up being used, information was being used by the Euro Christian missionaries with the intention to destroy the cultures and some of this stuff has survived. So one copy here we have of Popol Vuh shows up in Chichicastenango, and it was hidden for centuries. Um, uh, it showed up in the back of Santo Tomas Church in Chichicastenango, which is a highland. It's up in the mountains, and if you go to the city, you can see that the Euro Christians built a church right on top of a Maya temple there. So the council book was hidden there for centuries. Original manuscript mentions grandsons of Maya kings burned at the stake by Pedro Alvarado's brutality, which was, so this must have been written to between 1554 and 1558. Um, Jimenez's copy of the text was once in 1704 in Ravenel, but then it sat unrecognized until 1854 when an Austrian traveler named Karl Scherzer found it in Guatemala City and then copied it. Then it was published in Europe. Its true antiquity wouldn't be discovered for another century. In the 1970s, Michael Coe, who's an archaeologist, recognized elements of the Popol Vuh stories on ancient Maya royal pottery. He made a museum exhibit reconstructing the tale from artifacts, proving that it was a much older tale. For centuries, it was an oral story. Again, this goes back to some of the stuff Barbara Alice Mann was saying. The oral story is still told today. It's still used in among Maya people today, and anthropologists and archaeologists sometimes don't believe it, but it's like here we have like the ancient evidence even by archaeologists saying like yes, this story is showing up in the most ancient of artifacts, so the story itself, the oral tradition, must be very, very old. There's a group of gods in the story. There's Heart of Sky or Hurricane, a newborn thunderbolt, sudden thunderbolt, the plumed serpent, who may be a contact influence from the Aztecs or the Mexica people. Um, uh, They go to a maker and a shaper. There are male and female gods showing that kind of twinship and gender balance thing that we see showing up in the twinned cosmos that Barbara Alice Mann has talked about. And then the words have powers themselves. Waters are part, and there's a land rising up like a turtle, which we might compare to Turtle Island. The gods create animals, but the animals couldn't speak back to the gods. Humans in this creation story are made out of mud, who could speak but then melted and were stiff and couldn't procreate. Then humans were made out of wood. So we see multiple human creations here. Humans were made out of wood for a while, but they could speak, but their minds and hearts were not proper, and that they were cruel to animals. So the animals were then allowed to eat them. And then we get a fourth creation where real humans um, uh, or are up here, or humans like us, I suppose, appear. Um, uh, but before then, we have these hero tr twins, Seven Macaw, and then uh, the twins Hanapu and Xbalanque, who remove his jeweled teeth. Is he royalty? We don't exactly know. So just be careful about people who are being too precise in their guesstimations of what is going on in terms of society. Multiple plates show a resurrection of a maize god and a paddler gods who set three hearthstones in Orion again. So there's that kind of cosmic alignment thing. Archaeoastronomy showing up for sure. This connects to the date August 11th, 3114 BCE, which is the starting of Maya time according to their calendar. Um, this is all happening during the um, kind of classical period. Up north, um, closer to Mexico City, if you go, you can take a bus from Mexico City to Teotihuacan today. I've done it before. It's worth the trip. Teotihuacan is northeast of Mexico City. It was built from a massive farmer migration around 150 BCE. The Pyramid of the Sun, which is in the south, is 63 meters tall. The moon in the north end. So there's a the sun and a moon pyramid, right, which is 43 meters tall. Um, Quitalela, or the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, and then Avenue of the Dead, which is a long walkway if you look at the images across the site, which is huge. Um, Again, the anthropologists like this word state, but that the connotations we have of state are, to me, too much part of the Euro-Christian tradition. But again, I'm pulling some of the stuff from Edwin Barnhart's work. But there's definitely trade. There's definitely a mercantile situation going on here. There are 2,000 apartment compounds with different crafts of obsidian. One was a Maya barrio and another a Zapotec. So we know that's like kind of like people coming from regions and setting up their own stalls. So there's a center for trade and commerce. There's a great goddess found nowhere else in Mesoamerica. There's a deity of the underworld slash death or a spider woman showing up. Jaguars show up who are eating human hearts. Human sacrifice appears to have been common, but never to the extent that the early conquistadors are claiming about how many people were being sacrificed. That much of it's overblown, and I tend not to emphasize it a lot. And the commerce, there's commerce all the way to South Honduras and probably South America. Um, there are architectural styles that influence Mayans by 300 CE. So there seems to be some cross influence. The leaders from Teotihuacan and southern cities shows influence and tension, but no evidence of actual battles between the cultures. So again, like we see over and over again, mm, people are getting, even with different cultures, tend to get along much more than they tend to be fighting each other. Then again, though, there's like a later situation where Maya seem to reject their goods. By the mid 400s, Maya reject architecture altogether, and by the mid 600s, Teotihuacan is destroyed. And so, what happens to that culture up there is more of a mystery. But of course, Maya folks tend to shift radically there at various different periods. They shift the ways that they live, and sometimes it has to do with their calendar. Their calendar is very complex, and they have a mathematical system. They have a symbol for zero, which I'll say more about in a minute. Maya mathematics are complex and they're still not completely understood. They have a base 20 counting system. You can see the dot there, we equaling one. You can see the bar equaling five, and then the shell, which equals zero. It's written symbols which are um, likely mirror objects for counting. Maya developed their concept of zero on their own. The long count calendar may assume zero, but no known date from the BCE period needed a zero. Uh, the first zero recorded according to the calendar is February 1st, 357 current era to translate it over into Euro-Christian dating. Now, this concept of zero, you might hear this and you might have already heard it somewhere. Some people say that the use of zero was one of the reasons that the Christians burned the Mayan books. I am working on an article right now about whether or not, well, trying to trace down where do we actually see textual evidence for this in the Euro-Christian tradition, or even in Europe, right? Where do we see a lot of cases where people like mathematicians are actually being burned at the stake or something like that because of their birth and because of the introduction of zero. And there's some good scholarship coming out of Oxford University on this that kind of seems to be pointing out that this is possibly a myth. So we have, and it has to do with the way that the tales of Copernicus and Galileo challenges to the church system and that shifting away from the Christian church to the age of reason or science like that. So there's been this story that's wanted to talk about the heroic scientists who were, treated poorly by the ignorant church. But what we see when we're looking back is that the first time zero it does enter into Christian culture. But it's invented in India and comes through Arabic cultures, through Islam. And so it's through the Crusades and that period of time that we start seeing the math showing up from the Far East. But the first incidences of that we see recorded are Christians not challenging it necessarily, but seeing that it's brilliant math. And so there's some stuff to be said about the prime mover, which is Aristotle's sort of version of God, and some th ways of thinking about philosophy and metaphysics from the early modern era. But what we don't see, just to bring it back to the point of the of zero and the Fibonacci sequence and things like this, that a lot of people like ancient history, like the ancient aliens and like the kind of History Channel stuff wants to make a whole lot more out of some of that stuff. Um, we don't see, like, even though it's new to Europe, we don't necessarily see records of people being burned at the stake for using the Fibonacci sequence, for example, or for using mathematical concepts of zero. But the way that Edwin Barnhart taught it in his lectures is that Jesuit priests saw zero when they came across these Maya codices, and declared that the books were heretical. We do know that in 1582, with the introduction of the Gregorian calendar, zero became okay, but Copernicus had used it earlier from 1473 to 1543 as fixing Christian calendar and heliocentrism, making it okay. So I want to say that, like, broadly speaking, among the Euro-Christians, because Copernicus had been around throughout the earlier period, and was at least a notable figure, that people might be over determining this idea that just because a culture is using zero, that that is what made the Euro-Christians want to burn their stuff. So I say more recently, scholars are claiming that this is a bit of a scholarly myth that um, I think the books were being burned when DeLanda burns them simply because they're non-Christian, right? Simply because they're thought of as teaching the Maya people to keep believing in their quote religion. So I am writing an article about this situation right now. So I'll let you know if things change. But right now, just one of the many things to put brackets around is that if somebody is like overtly referring to like, oh yes, it was because they had zero in their math and that's why their books got burned. I think that's an overdetermination. Back to the calendar, though. The calendar is still in use by Maya today in the Highlands. There's a bar and dot system with a base 20. Days are not divided. There's only night, day, and moon through the night. There's a 260-day calendar with unique day names. It's based on a cycle, not a machine with gears. What happened before will happen again, which is really funny because all the 2012 people that I was joking about in last lecture, they had this kind of millennial conception. What's going to happen at the end of the Mayan calendar? It's like, well, the Maya culture is just like it's like things that will happen before will happen again, right? So there is no like ultimate creation or ultimate destruction. There are 20 day signs, each with their own symbol plus 13 numbers, which only sync up once every 260 days. It's not just the Maya, but broadly Mesoamerica that are seeing things in the way of this calendar. There is no calendar, however, near Teotihuacan. 260 days is 9 months or the human gestation period, and people were often named for their birthday and traditional Maya culture. Um, Later, there's the solar calendar that shows a 365-day cycle that's added, but the earliest calendar stuff comes from Zapotecs and Oaxaca. There's a 52-year cycle, or the earliest of those solar calendars, right? There's a 52-year cycle, uh, a year barrier system of 105 plus 260-day cycle. Each revolution through the system lands on only one of the 4 days from a 260-day calendar. It lands on a house, rabbit, reed, or flint. I would notice that there's four there, four elements. The Maya Hobbs system of 18 had 18 months with 20 days each, plus one 5 day month, which equals 365 days. So this was a unique solar calendar, but with no leap year, but it records solar events on a 52-year cycle. Beyond the 52-year cycle, the long count comes in, and there's a linear account of days with a specific start date as zero. Again, that date is August 11th, 3114 BCE, and nobody knows why. The mythological events occur before then, uh, and 13.0.0.0.0 is the start day, which began the fourth creation. The distance count allowed them to discuss multiple events in a single text. So 9 lords of the night are referred to 9 protectors or protector spirits on either side of one's birthday. Thus, there's a 9 day week, 819 day cycle invented to include Jupiter and Saturn's periods. There's a 949-day cycle, which is a hidden number behind the long count. 949, 73, and 13 are unique numbers in the system, integrating solar plus planetary cycles. The year 1,195,740 is an important number for unifying all different counts. All Maya cities are independent, quote, city states. Again, that state, I'm not sure that that's the right word. Um, uh, Maya rulers were founded on their ability to talk to their ancestors, employing Mayan people to talk to other folks. What is to talk to ancestors. Shows a kind of liaison again with the gods, and like again that term God, like this is something Tinker is always saying, like there isn't necessarily a word for God in the indigenous languages, right? So it's problematic, and just like we just want to have that kind of flexibility around things. When city states did war with each other, it didn't seem to be for land, but for access to ancestors. And I'm not exactly sure how anthropologists are coming up with that, but that's an interesting point. In the world context, if we took Maya culture and looked at the globe, I'm not going to do this a lot in the course, but we see hieroglyphics and writing showing up in different places in the world. We're seeing first human paintings around 30,000 years ago in Sumerian, Egyptian, and Chinese cultures. There's also Harappan, which is an Indus script from the Indus Valley civilization, which you may have heard of. That it's not readable yet, at least at the time that I'm making this. No one has deciphered it, but it exists over there. Super interesting. And the Maya people are no different from these other ancient peoples, except that their Maya painting appears to be more visually elaborate than the Asiatic. And the word tsib in Maya culture today means both writer and painter. Maya scribes could also vary the look of their symbols, and the Maya invented on their own paper and books as well. So when we think about the Maya books, like what's sad about it is that there's only four left in the world today. Diego de Landa, who is a Franciscan missionary who enters the Yucatan in 1549, learned Mayan, and then in 1562 he held a mass book burning. Conquistadors thought he was too harsh. He was then imprisoned and sent back to Spain. It sounds like kind of like what happened to Columbus, and wrote there he wrote relation of things in the Yucatan. He had transliterated sounds from a Mayan scribe, but not all of the Mayan alphabet. DeLanda forced a Mayan scribe to write any sentence in his book. And then 400 years later, when the actual sentence was translated, we see that the Mayan scribe wrote down, "I don't want to." So that says something about the forcefulness, right? And the attitude of the scribe towards DeLanda. By 1600, it appears that no Mayan folks knew how to read or write Mayan. I am not sure exactly how that's being based, but so just maybe take it with a grain of salt until you dig more into it. The codices were fan-folded books. We do have in the Dresden Codex, which was one of those four codices that still exists, Alexander von Humboldt published 5 pages of it in 1810 in a book on art, but he didn't know what the symbols meant. And then we see Constantine Samuel Rafinesque making first steps at deciphering the Mayan language or Mayan writing system anyway. And he figured out the numbers system in 1832. And then Stevens and Catherwood show up and they're influential as well. And so a little bit more about just the translation of the history. We see that there are copies of the Codex showing up around 1848. So there's more copies, so it means more people are working on it. In the late 1800s, the Maya calendar is rediscovered. And then in Russia, their Russian-born scholars overthrew earlier opinions by Thompson, and they rejected that the script reflected words. He rejecting his own student Tatiana Proskurkiakov's discovery of repeating glyphs representing birth, ascension to the throne, and death was published in 1960. Um, um, Proskorkiakov's work is inspired by two others, Heinrich Berlin, who found emblem glyphs representing city names. But then it seems to be like to be accurate here that Yuri Knorozov first broke the code in the glyphs around 1952, but the Russians were not being talking to the Americans because of the Cold War. He had saved the Dresden Codex from the American bombing in World War II. And then Thompson later rejected the Russians due to Cold War biases and forbade students to read Knorosov's book. So Knorosov then was translated Delanda into Russian and compared it to the Codex. Then he compared the modern Quiche language, which he kept the sounds that could relate the words back to the glyphs. That's how he figured it out. Michael Coe and his wife then translated Knorosov, and in 1973, the code was deciphered at a Palenque roundtable, proving phonetic relations to the alphabet. Linda Sheely and Stewart at UT Austin were part of this, and that what we see as a logosyllabic writing system. They dropped the last vowel from a consonant, and columns represent or columns read two at a time by fours. The language, and this will be important for some of our worldview stuff that Tink Tinker says, because it's a major example of uh, a verb object subject language instead of subject verb object. So when we talk about worldview differences being closely related to language, we see that a lot of native languages are verb centered rather than noun centered, right? So the English language works in syntactically rigidly. I am Roger, right? I is the first person pronoun, it's the subject, verb am. Roger is the object, right? If I switch it up and I say, Roger, I am, I sound like Yoda or something like that. And if I put the verb first, I say, am I Roger, which actually creates the question itself. So, uh, just important to note that the Mayan language is verb centered. And dates and numbers act as punctuation in the sentences, which is super interesting. It all ties into Maya astronomy. There's a zenith, or these things called passages, which only happen in the tropics, so they're not visible necessarily up here where I'm at. They divide up the year again, as I said, into 260 days of the Mayan calendar, and then 105 days of summer being corn gestation period for during the summer itself. So the seasons are being tracked, but apparently according to growth. I already mentioned like the 9 month cycle, the just human gestation cycle being tracked. Hob is the name for solar years in Mayan, and so they're in 1508, 15 1508 Hob years equals 1507, with a leap day difference in tropical years. But one stela or stela A in Copan, which is one of the cities, records 6,940 days, equaling 19 tropic years. So the Maya record 235 lunations, which equals 19 tropical years. And then at 1508 Hobbs, you increase the accuracy of the sun's passage to account for the leap day. So they were precise enough that they actually were accounting for leap days. So Mayans to translate it, like record 365.2420 days versus the atomic clock, which records 365.2422 days. But they admit, the atomic clock people admit that it's off by plus or minus 0.005 days. So basically, the Maya developed a system accounting for leap days for tracking time and solar and lunar situations that is as precise as the atomic clock. Pretty cool. The Dresden Codex, which is kind of blurry on this image, but you can look it up. You can find it on archive.org and look at zero in on the images if you want. It's made from a mate tree bark paper, which was invented about 300 CE. It's fan folded, as I said earlier, and it's the same size as Western books. The Mexica or the Aztec tribute documents show the influence from the Maya. So it seems like the Maya invent books and writing and this kind of folding situation, and then it's picked up by and because like I mean the Mexica culture is much older, is much younger. You know that they hadn't been around a super long time before the Europeans showed up. So unfortunately, there out of all of the books in Mesoamerica, there are only 15 left today. And so four of them are going to be the Mayan ones, and then the other 11 are going to be the Mexica or Aztec ones. Um, so there's a Madrid Codex, a Paris Codex Scrollier, and Dresden, and maybe Prague. There's Dresden, um, uh, um, and in the Yucatan is the 12th most popular book, I think is what I mean there. Um, it was likely sent by Cortez to um, Charles the First, which is how it ends up over in Europe. It's 78 pages long and has 350 unique signs. This is what that Russian linguist Knorozov got a facsimile of, which helped him decode the Maya system. So Mayans calculated by sidereal years, which track the movement of the sun over a 33,000 year period in the Codex and on the Stela. The number 1,366,560 is a repeated number tying all sorts of contexts and gods together. This is super, super sophisticated stuff. Um, there's a ball game happening in Maya culture. There are eyewitness accounts of it from Diego Duran, who's the early conquistador. But the game, evidence of the game shows up at 4,000 years, being at least 4,000 years old. It seems to symbolize keeping the sun in the sky and connecting to ancestors. The oldest known quartz that we can tell are about 1400 BCE. But the game we can see is much older than that, right? There are over 1,300 ball courts across Mesoamerica. It's a really popular game. It connects to the story from the Popol Vuh. If you read the story, it's kind of like like they're playing the ball game in Popol Vuh. And it reenacts the creation story. It tells of a descent into an underworld where some of the characters die and ascend, and they raise a maze god. There's also that turtle's back, which cracks open, and maze god ascends as well. So there's that turtle connection showing up. Um, uh, they crack mirrors. Uh, I'm not sure what I mean there, so sorry about that. And then oh right, you can see I think sometimes in the mirrors and the obsidian mirrors you can be using it to track the sun and stuff. But we also see Orion's constellation, especially the three belt dots showing up, like I said, over and over again in different contexts, even the Maya kitchens. So then we see the end of the classic period. And the reason why I think that the archaeologists call this the end of the classic period is because people shift out of the city. So the cities appear to be abandoned around 800 CE if we're using Euro-Christian calendar time. Um, Tonina has the last monument at about 909. And there's a central Mexican influence that starts showing up in northern Mayan cities in the lowlands. Some theorize endemic warfare or the idea that elite families appear to be the targets of attacks, but recorded warfare doesn't last through centuries. So peace had been made, and then even places with no warfare evidence show evidence of people leaving the cities, right? So again, it's like we just need to kind of get rid of that kind of that people are just like inherently violent. idea. Drought is a popular theory for why people maybe left the cities. Possibly humans caused environmental degradation is something that some people have speculated as well. And this happens like people make these speculations about ancient sites all over because there is a phenomenon in ancient sites around the world of people leaving cities. But I think it has more to do, at least with Maya folks, it has to do with calendar things that they seem to change their habits at different times in their calendar, if you ask me. Um, uh, so in some places, there's no deforestation, there's no evidence of drought, there's no evidence of warfare, yet people still leave the cities. That's why I'm saying like there has to be a different explanation. Some theorize a volcanic eruption, like maybe El Chichon. There was in a 1982 eruption, it affected the weather as far as away as Siberia. It's a big deal if you're down and you see the volcanoes down in Guatemala near Lake Atitlan down there. They're serious forces that and when they're always smoking and they erupted a little bit the year that I was there back in like 2018 or so. Um, so there are massive weather changes that can occur if eruptions occur. Um, the abandonments happen across Mesoamerica, though. Around 650 CE, Teotihuacan burns. And at least up there, that's remember northeast of Mexico City, elites are targeted, leaving a power vacuum. So again, it's like, okay, well, here's that kind of war theory coming in, both the elites and the revolution and people being overthrown. But we don't know exactly. And then in West Mexican populations, we also see this all the cities being abandoned. Anasazi, which is not really the right term. So ancient Pueblo culture is the better term now because Anasazi meant like kind of means an enemy. And so, but it still shows up in the literature, and Edwin Barnhart was using it, so that's why it's in the notes here. But ancient Pueblo is the better term. Hohokam culture. So those would be cultures up near Mesa Verde here in Colorado and into the Southwest. They start thriving around the 750s, so there might be a migration going up north at this period. We'll come back to that idea because I think there's something to that. Public art shows despots losing power. It's less king-centered, and that's at least where some of the anthropologists are getting that idea of the elite culture or revolution sort of thing. Um, Residential burials may have become an issue. Houses eventually become ancestor worship places. That pattern may have led to abandoned places that become then revisited to connect to ancestors. So it's not like you're leaving them in ruins, but you're leaving them as a place to come back to commune with ancestors. The Maya people today still refer to the jungle cities, at least in Guatemala, as their cities. They don't inhabit them, but they're still their cities. So that memory and that connection is still there. Way more dead were being remembered than were living there, so that might have been a reason some people suggest for abandoning them. They may become necropolises. Um, the 10th Baktun in the long count shows up as 830 CE, current era if we use Euro-Christian time. Um, and that might have initiated a massive change. That's what I was saying about the calendar may give us something more accurate. Day keepers, which is what they're called today in Guatemala, day keepers say that they're people who keep the calendar. Say that these are times to change and renew and do things new. So again, I want to believe the actual native people when they say why changes happen. Ninth and 10th Baktun also appears to be the age of kings and then a shift to a council system. So yeah, there might have been something like an elite culture, but I don't know about these words like despot and kings and things like that. But what it seems to be more likely is that Maya folks, when something happens significant with the calendar system, they actively change their governance system. And that's something that I'll see, I'll note with my friend Tink Tinker with Washache culture with Gallega, which is a term that gets translated as chief. And like the Euro Christians always want to say, oh, there's one chief or like one king or like and it's almost always male or something like that. But really there's two Gallega. There's a man and a woman, and they flip off from day after day, right? In his culture. So the way he talks about it is like having Hillary Clinton president one day and Donald Trump Clinton the next, and then switching back. So like if there isn't agreement or if somebody's making wildly erratic moves, they're going to be tempered by the next person over, right? And so I think that the native cultures themselves have more to tell us about uh, about governance systems than maybe like speculations about massive wars or things like that. It's not to say that wars didn't happen at different times, just like Barbara Mann says, right? Yes, like wars happen, but there was Euro-Christians have for centuries overdetermined and said that the people, but native peoples were more warlike than they really are. Then in 1225 CE, in 11th Bactun, we see that the council system ends too. And so there are other cultures that are not following the long count that shifted too. So, yeah, lots to think about. Anthropologists then call the next period Terminal Classic from 800 to 1000 CE. During this period, there are different buildings and architecture. I tried to pull something that they're not usually as tall, and they're more flat, and that's part of that council period as well. There's little evidence of fighting during the period. In the Yucatan, there's architecture that mimics humble huts. Gods become more prominent in public art, and Uxmal was planned and built in one phase. So we do see cooperation in large-scale urban planning. There's also a lot of central Mexican features that are sort of cross um, and being shown some cross influence. Now, if I get to the end here and I talk about uh, as the Europeans are sort of coming in and what's going on from the boats coming in. Over in Europe, we have to remember that in 1453, the Ottoman Empire sacks Constantinople, and they block trading on the Silk Road with the Far East, which means that all of the Western Europeans need to try and find other ways, which they're you eventually like sailing around Cape Horn down at the bottom of South Africa is like really hard because it's treacherous to try and to until they figure out that to navigate it, you actually like have to go like the Cape of Good Hope, right? So, Cape Horn, did I say? Um, uh, um, you have to sail out, further out to get the right current to really make it around the Cape and down at the southern point of Africa. So yeah, this is where Columbus comes in, and he's trying to find a way to find a trade with Eastern Europe or India and China. He's influenced by Toscanelli's erroneous measurements based on the Arabic mile instead of the Roman one. Portugal first turns him down. The English turn him down as well. So he gets funding, more funding from merchants in Italy actually than Spain. But he does get from he gets the official kind of Christian prince sort of thing, which will come up in Doctrine of Discovery from the Spanish crown. We know that Leif Erikson and the Vikings had visited Newfoundland in North America, as they call it now, or Turtle Island, around the year 1000. So just of Columbus, of course, is not the first European over here. In 1492, he wrecks the Santa Maria on Haiti and names it Hispaniola. But a few days earlier on the voyage is when he lands on Guanahani and renames it San Salvador. So that's that Euro-Christian remaking of the land by baptizing it according to their savior, and then eventually converting the land into property. They do the same thing with people, where they convert them, they give them Christian names, and then make slaves out of them. 1493, there's 17 ships. So he comes back in 1493 with 17 ships and 1,200 men to colonize. In 1499, he and his brothers are despised by Europeans and natives alike. And that's Columbus, right? In 1500, Columbus is accused of genocide of the natives by killing by Europeans themselves. He's convicted of crimes and sent back in chains. Genocide is a later term and a later word that we'll use, but yes, he's accused of attempting to kill off all of the natives. Um, uh, he is then stripped of his titles and his wealth. He's no longer governor of the Caribbean. In 1502, Columbus refuses to go back, or is refused a request to go back to Hispaniola. So then he lands in Honduras. Spaniards then meet a Maya trading ship over there. They steal the ship and the cargo because that's what the first thing they do. Um, there's a Taino man who could communicate with the Mayan man, showing that there was cross-cultural contact going on and communication and trade going on with the continent and the Taino, who would have been a Caribbean person. Um, then there's a ship that Gonzalo Guerrero that's lost to Alvarado. That stuff will come up a little bit in some of our later talks or readings. So I'm not going to go too far into that. This is going to conclude the Maya lecture, except that as I'm stopping sharing here, I just want to come back to the idea I was talking about, like the movement north that seems to be happening. Because if you watch the Chaco Canyon videos, there's a couple of good documentaries now. One is called the Blade of the Sun or something, or and one is like written in the earth, or I can't written in the desert, something like that. I can't remember the exact titles. Um, but there are two good documentaries and a lot of more recent research on Chaco Canyon. And we know now that Chaco Canyon is not only is it this massive solar alignment based complex that's of like huge, not just even the huge buildings at the main site, but many, many satellite sites. We also know now that it's built um, in a direct north-south alignment with Paquime and Palenque, which is a city in Mexico and a city down in Guatemala. And that the ancient Pueblo people, or even current day Pueblo peoples, Zuni peoples, Tewa people, Hopi, like, there's a lot of people in the region that will say that in their oral traditions say that their ancestors, some of them came up from down south. Now, it also seems that Chaco Canyon seems to be a site that is built that only a few, not that it could house tons and tons of people, but there weren't that many people living there constantly. And so the speculation has been that Chaco Canyon is really a space that's being built for ancestors too. So it's like just something to think about, like, well, with that theory of like, well, we're had too many previous people died, and that's why people leave cities. Is there some sort of relationship there? Well, we would have to contrast that with people migrating northward, which like in Mexica culture, the north, everything, the direction towards the north is the direction towards the land of the dead, too, right? So that makes sense for Chaco Canyon, but I don't know if it makes sense for leaving earlier cities because of that. It's something just to maybe think about as you're kind of I'm thinking about this stuff. But as always, it's like, well, I mean, current day people, Pueblo people who are telling anthropologists, like, oh, yeah, well, we have in our oral stories that there's this direct connection to our ancestors. And so Edwin Barnhart has done some really cool work on the way that windows show up in the temples and some of the architectural features that he seems to see as showing a direct influence in Chaco Canyon with Maya cultures from down south. And then, but the really striking thing is like these cities that are, you know, thousands of miles like apart from each other, but all being built exactly on the same axis. So the math and the solar calculations and the architectural feats, to me, they blow away pretty much. And there's like great cool things in the ancient world all around the world. I'm not saying like, oh, they're better or anything like that. But the reason why I'm so first of all, I'm interested in Native American cultures, but I'm also like, I'm always trying to push back on this like really, really heavy bias that somehow the Native American cultures were somehow less civilized or something like that. It's like they invent their own writing. They build it like how many things do we have to tell times to tell people or show people how much more trade, how much more peace, how many thousands of years of no warfare show up with city after city after city. But in the Euro-Christian's mind, it's like, oh, well, they were all like sacrificing, like human sacrifice, and like all this kind of stuff that really comes out of the conquistadors' biases and the Christian biases that then filter their way into academia, right? And we have to really undo. We're in a period of time in scholarship around this stuff where we really need to undo that kind of stuff, right? So it's not about like always claiming origins, like, well, the pyramids in South America predate Egypt, so That's not so much. It's not about the earlier stuff. It's just that when the Euro-Christians come up with this civilization narrative and they claim it for themselves, they're saying that other people didn't have it. And we have to say, like, yes, they did have it, and they even have it before the people that you're claiming that you get civilization from. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'll pick up with one more before our Columbus video, and then we've got to carry on into the Euro-Christian invasion. Take care.